This morning, for the short keynote that we have, what I'd like to do is take you on a brief tour, a brief history walk. For those of you who are really knowledgeable about disability history, you'll forgive me that this may be a bit of a Disney version. You'll get that pun in a moment, where I'm going to drop out lots of really big facts and pieces of information, and really focus on a conversation about kids primarily with the most extensive support needs, those that get labels of significantly and profoundly labeled. We'll leave it there for now. On that tour, we'll hopefully share some common likes and interests along the way. I hail from New Hampshire. This too will become relevant in this morning's story. It's a beautiful state if you ever get a chance to go there. Our state license plate usually is what most people know about us. It says live free or die. So we believe in choice making, which is good to know. It is an active choice making state. And we're really about kind of local community and local roots. I was born and raised in Rochester, New Hampshire, about 30 minutes away from where I currently live. And my entire family was born and raised there. So I have very limited life experience to share with you this morning during the keynote. My current hometown, Newington, New Hampshire, is the home of the United States' oldest town forest, which I just think is a really nifty fact to share with people, so I do. It's just a short walk from my home, and beautiful to kind of have that little piece of history in downtown Newington Village, population 382. During this morning's keynote, I also am going to have you flash back to certain times in your life. Coming from Rochester, New Hampshire, and not having traveled a lot throughout my childhood and into my college years, there were only certain outlets that would give me a broader perspective on the world. And one of them, of course, was movies. What was happening for you in 1977? See, it immediately gets people going. It is a common ground. So what were you doing in 1977? Were you in education? I was 10. I was just getting started in the world. But a really important law came into play just around that same time. Public Law 94-142. There was lots of activity that led up to this, but a big punchline for us around that piece of legislation was that 1 million kids were not attending public schools at all. They were home. They weren't getting taught. They were not even physically in the room. In those early years after Public Law 94-142, there was a series of kind of thinking pieces and people somewhere between really excited and completely freaking out. And the leaders at the time, the best practice was to think about bringing kids with the most significant disabilities into neighborhood schools in specialized classrooms with specialized supports. So at that time, in the mid to late 70s into the early 80s, we were thinking about kids being physically present in our local neighborhood schools if they had a significant disability, and being in proximity to their peers, and us wrapping around to facilitate those interactions. That was best practice at the time. An interesting piece that happened shortly after, which happens with new legislation, was lots of testing of that legislation. Like, did you really mean all kids when you passed that? Said the education of all handicapped children? We're back to that quote, does all really mean all? And my hometown helped answer the question. My hometown, Rochester, New Hampshire, decided that there was a student who was too disabled to benefit from services. That was too disabled to attend his neighborhood school, Timmy W. And fortunately, Timmy W., his family, and a lot of support from our state wrapped around and said, no, this is his right. He does not have to meet certain eligibility criteria to be able to go to his neighborhood school. That case ended up setting really important precedent for us in our work today in education, which was this notion that you don't have to kind of meet a certain level of criteria to get services to be in your local neighborhood school. Nobody is too disabled to attend their neighborhood school. You don't have to prove that you're going to benefit from services in order to get them. Now, my background is in speech pathology with a particular eye on augmentative communication, for those of you who know that field. I'm really interested in people who don't use traditional speech or writing for communication. And when I got to college, I had never met anybody with a significant disability. I just told you a little bit about my hometown's experience, and that was around the time I was graduating from high school. I got to college, and I took a course with this woman, Jan Nesbitt, who struck me as interesting. I learned a lot from her. In her course, she got a lot of other people to come in and actually teach the course, which I dug about her. That was really nice delegation. About halfway through the course, I came in one day, and I'm sitting in the back of the class, which is where you would usually find me. And this guy is coming down the hallway on a scooter, and I see he has a disability. And I hear him mumbling, but I'm not understanding the words, and he's got an assistant with him, and he's got a dog with him, and Jan, the instructor, is talking with him, and he's saying things back, but then he's like, I can't understand him, and I'm thinking, okay, she's probably going to talk about him today during class. Like he's the prop to make a point for the class. And it turns out that that guy then pulled out a big communication board with letters and words all over it, and he started tapping away on the board, and Jan stood there and read aloud the words that he was tapping on. So this is late 1980s. And I'm completely freaked out in the back of the room. He's cracking jokes and making statements that are going way over my head, and I cannot reconcile this. I have no life experience to draw from to make sense of this person that I'm meeting and the assumptions I had had of him when I saw him coming down the hallway with all of his supports. And then to see him in this context, tapping on letters and words and giving the lecture for our course, blew me out of the water, and I knew at that moment, I have to get my head around this. I have to understand this. How is it I can be in my 20s and not understand who this person is in the world, have nothing to give context to this? Well, it turns out that that guy that I thought Jane was going to talk about was Bob Williams. This is Bob Williams. Some of you probably know Bob Williams. He went on to be the Commissioner for the Administration on Developmental Disabilities and various other posts within the Clinton administration. Not a slump. Kind of a big thinker. Kind of a policy go-to guy. Bob really rocked and changed my world and changed my path. I immediately started focusing on communication supports for people who couldn't share information in other means. Now I'm going to advance a few years. Grad school was boring. You don't want to hear about that. One of my first jobs when I got out of grad school was back at the University of New Hampshire, and we had a focus on assistive technology. It was a particular interest, and it was a real burgeoning area at the time, in the mid-90s. And I started working with this guy, Stephen, down in Massachusetts, or for you, up and over in Massachusetts. I met him in 4th grade, and the team called me in because they were at a decision point. Stephen has multiple labels: seizure disorder, medically fragile, tuberous sclerosis, intellectual disability, autistic-like tendencies. I mean, he's got an awesome file with him, right? Rocket Stephen. But the team, although he had been included physically in the his neighborhood school since he was in kindergarten, they really were at a point where they didn't know what he knew. They didn't know if he was gaining any benefit from being in the general ed setting. His medical supports were getting increasingly complex. And there was a push from an evaluation group in a nearby major city who was recommending, these big medical experts with lots of titles and labels themselves, were saying that Stephen should go into a residential facility. And his family was really not thrilled with this idea, and yet the school was showing no confidence in being able to support Stephen locally. I mean, imagine the experience as a teacher going in every day and feeling like you're not making a difference for a child. That everything you try, you just don't see the response that shows you that what you're doing is making the difference. It's defeating. I give them hats off for sticking with that for 4 years and trying things every day, coming up with new ways. So I got involved and we started talking about his communication system, which really didn't include a lot of things aside from he sang, and the tunes tend to match his mood. One day I observed him in an occupational therapy session, actually the first day I met him, and at the time, The Lion King was the big movie that was out. Sorry to stray from Star Wars for a moment. All due respect, Lucas. The occupational therapist was having him do this very repetitive activity, and he started singing, "Nobody knows the troubles that I've seen." And she does her ignore the behavior, focus on the task, redirect, right? I'm not going to engage in that verbal, "Nobody knows the troubles that I've seen." And I'm just watching him, and I'm trying not to laugh, because that would probably not be appropriate. He was trying to communicate with them in lots of ways. They didn't know how to recognize that. We worked together for several months to get some communication supports in place for him. And once we got the communication supports in place, although there were still lots of other things that he needed in his life to assist him, he started engaging in general ed instruction in the general ed classroom in a way that he had never engaged before. And he started showing us that he knew and could learn things that nobody ever anticipated he could know or learn. So here he is independently choosing from an array of choices that we would make kind of every day for every lesson. It was grueling. Hand-baking things that were coming up in the next hour to make sure that he had vocabulary and symbols for choice-making in front of him. By 5th grade, they had him engaged in grade-level work. Within a year, this child that was about to go to residential placement with a focus on functional life skills was now engaged in learning and demonstrating learning of the general education curriculum. Their confidence shifted in beautiful ways. He went on to middle school, and the principal welcomed Stephen into the middle school with the notion of, whatever it's going to take, we will do it. We will figure this out. I've heard the story of Stephen, which in this case was actually a good thing. And I want that to happen in my middle school. The principal led the charge and he led the way, which becomes really important in our thinking about work in inclusive education. In that school district, we were doing one kid at a time. We started with Stephen, we added Craig, we added Ben, we just one kid at a time, right? And that's really resource heavy every day to be making that level of support. Is this sustainable without the 3 leaders in the district who are really hunkered in and committed to this? What happens if they leave? Fortunately for Stephen, those leaders stayed in place. He went on to graduate with a regular diploma from high school, went on to community college for a short stint, but really wanted to run his own business, which is what he does to this day. And then the second release of Star Wars movies brings us to a new version of thinking about inclusive education. It's an interesting lineup here. Around 97, IDEA gets reauthorized, reinforcing all the basic tenets and civil rights that were in the original legislation, and giving us 2 important new concepts here around access to the general curriculum, which is what we were experiencing in Stephen's story and was happening across the country. And people were realizing, this needs to become our standard. We can do this. And something that would soon become a little bit of a threat to those of us thinking we were leading the field, that all students with disabilities would participate in the assessment systems of their local schools, which seemed like a really good idea. And then we had No Child Left Behind, which came in 2002. And the era of accountability started with us. So now we've got large-scale accountability assessments and a law that says even kids with the most significant disabilities have to participate in that. The policy was a wee bit ahead of practice in that way. We had no such assessments on hand, and it forced conversations in the field that were much needed. What do we actually know about how to assess the learning for this population in a meaningful way? 2005, 2004, but of course regs weren't out until well into 2005, we had another big shift. So just within a short window here of those Star Wars movies, we have a legislative commitment to using response to intervention, school-wide approaches, and looking at how students respond to good, high-quality instruction, and using that as a way to get to specific learning disability diagnoses. Real shift for us in the field, to think about the importance of having delivered high-quality core instruction and being able to document whether or not that got a response from students before we're moving on to other considerations. Those shifts, access to general curriculum, assessment participation, paired with the accountability era and the shift to school-wide RTI models, really pushed efforts across the country. Ours was only one of many that was occurring that was looking very hard at this concept of not only participating in, but learning the general education curriculum. Thus, our Beyond Access project came into play because we were already seeing kids from our work that had access to the general curriculum. We actually wanted to get to demonstrating learning. Was Stephen an exception to the rule? Were all these other kiddos that we were hearing stories about exceptions to the rule, or could we standardize that and replicate it in a way that would show there were new understandings we could have of kids with the most significant labels? So we engaged in that work by thinking about communication supports, environmental supports, and flipping the conversation. In typical IEP meetings, we start with present level of performance. And we write goals based on current functioning and current present levels of performance. And then we go back out to talk about setting and where all that's going to happen. And we actually flipped the conversation. We said, well, don't most teachers start by building a community of learners and thinking about membership and belonging within their classrooms? What if we used that as an arena to develop communication supports for kids with the most significant disabilities, those who would participate in this thing called alternate assessment? What if we then refined those supports and actually got them engaged and participating in that core high-quality instruction? Might we discover something new about them? Which meant for a while setting aside the what can he learn question and first get to how can we support him well challenge. To date, we still have a horrible dilemma around this in our country. About 50% of the kids who should have augmentative communication supports like Stephen, like Bob Williams, don't have any support. No communication device in hand. So how can I say I think I know what you know or are capable of learning if I've never given you the pen, pencil, writing implement communication tools to engage in that learning? Right? We got a little cart before the horse thing going on here. So we were trying to flip the cart and the horse in our work, and we had some really interesting findings. Like others around the country, we were seeing that kids had these kinds of communication systems. I call them the nasty 9. These are 9 of the items that you're likely to find on a kid's communication device if they have one, and if they have a label of a significant disability. One of the students that we worked with in our first project, his team, including his family, and this was a real tension for us, described this 8-year-old boy as functioning at a 2-year-old level. And people said it with confidence. He functions at a 2-year-old level. And that drove how they thought about adaptations and supports for him. But when we changed the communication supports and got him using words other than hi, goodbye, hungry, bathroom, help, and mad, and I say to all audiences, I argue if this were all the things you could say, you would be mad too. That would be the button you'd be pushing. Right? But when you can actually put together 2- and 3-word and 4-word sentences using pronouns and action verbs and helping verbs, you start to see a student who is engaged in classroom supports. His related service providers, speech pathologists and occupational therapists in this photo, coming into the classroom, not to figure out how can you learn these skills out there, but how can we adjust the supports for you in the context where you need to communicate. The speech pathologist was really clear. She's like, I could work really hard every day trying to create great communication opportunities for Jay in my room. That's not where he needs to use them. Besides, we've got all these talking kids around him, let's leverage them. She was really smart about that. General ed teacher got on board as well. Within about a year and a half, we saw a student who had his desk alongside everybody else. We were working on getting his paraprofessional to be more than 3 feet away from him at any given moment in the day, which was a struggle for quite a while there. But he was both physically in the room and very with and connected with his classmates. He was participating in general ed instruction. We got him an electronic device, so he actually had a voice in his lessons, which was really powerful for him. That first day when he put together a thought and interrupted the teacher during her direct instruction was awesome. And we saw a student by the end of the year who, with pretty heavy adaptations of grade level text, we were literally rewriting novels that he was using, right? Something that we actually have great technology to do for us now. We were rewriting books, and by the end of the year, we saw a student who would go grab his adapted books during independent reading time, go sit alongside his classmates, flip open that book, start on page 1, and follow the words, and start vocalizing aloud. Looks a lot like reading. Maybe we're ready to actually give him a little quiz on comprehension here. Turns out he was understanding the key factors in the books. And his classmates really loved his adapted novels, and they were caught leveraging his adapted novels because after the first couple of in-class quizzes, they figured out Jack basically has the cliff notes of all the stuff we're reading. So we would really like that, please. I'll take 2 of those. That'd be great. Now that's all still one kid at a time.
We became part of the Positive Behavioral Interventions and Support System, PBIS, back when the state of New Hampshire first provided that as an opportunity. So we really looked at that as how we could provide a good, strong, universal basis. And then we have students who we may need a more intense program with. For those, we'll bring in quite a few staff people, possibly some people from the community who are involved in wraparound services, and look with them how we can support them through not only our own but area agencies. We want to make sure that the classroom teacher is the pivotal person. There are individual meetings each week so that the classroom teacher would come to the meeting so that the special education providers would have an idea of what the classroom teacher is working on so that all of their lessons can be supportive of what the regular classroom is doing. Somersworth is not an affluent community. We do not have a lot of economic resources. However, we feel like we are people rich. Has just been committed to that kind of an approach ever since we began working with students with significant disabilities. It's just who we are. Yeah.
So with Tasha, we start to resituate the work. You hear her principal talking about, and I'll put the principal back on, lost that picture. You hear the principal talking about school-wide PBIS, and at least a conversation of linking how we're supporting Tasha back into the context of how we support all kids, which was a really important framework to have. And that was a big shift in practice for us, to start to think to move, particularly for kids with the most complex support needs, away from this one kid at a time, and what would the systems of capacity be? What would they look like if we built them that way? In Tasha's case, her experience in that school really informed a district-wide effort to extend beyond PBIS, school-wide positive behavioral interventions and supports, and to also look at response to intervention and instruction on the academic side. We then worked with them for about 5 years to braid and integrate and unify those two systems together, all the while using lessons from Tasia and from various other students across their system to inform the design effort. So maybe we're not there yet for sustainability. Okay, well, what are we learning from this school and this student? So still with an eye to individuals, but coming back to say, let's continuously improve our design so that we're not always doing this one kid at a time piece. Our belief was if we design it well, with all the variety and true variability of our student population, we'll be more successful long-term in the district. That work aligned very well with the shifts that were happening nationally. And so with the last release of Star Wars movies, we're arriving at the work of the S.W.I.F.T Center. And I know that's all what you've been waiting to hear about. So in 2012, our center was funded. And we spent the first year or so studying sites from around the country, like the example from Maplewood Elementary in Somersworth, New Hampshire, and Dorchester, Massachusetts, and out in California, going to schools, going to districts where it was working and had been sustained. What were they doing? And could we learn from that? So we studied several sites across the country, sent out teams of people to analyze family engagement and what does quality instruction look like and what are the staffing and service delivery arrangements and what's the administrative leadership look like and how can we pull all of that information together. Our charge as a center is a National Technical Assistance Center funded by the Office of Special Ed Programs out of the United States Department of Education with braided funding from the Office of Elementary and Secondary Education. We were looking at building school and district capacity to support schools, to provide those academic and behavior supports in a way that would improve outcomes for all kids. So while we have this focus on disability, we're thinking also about the kid from poverty, the English language learner, the kid who's a real accelerated learner in enrichment programs, gifted and talented, the full diversity of students that actually show up on Monday. And what would the design look like with that level of variability in mind? We shifted our attention from thinking about allocating resources to individuals to reallocation of resources across entire systems. What would happen if we shifted our focus from this conversation of placement of kids with disabilities toward the structural elements that would support those placements, the decision-making systems? And what we were landing on as we studied these sites across the country was a school-wide approach that was driven by multi-tiered system of support, which is bringing RTI for academics and PBIS for behavior together into a unified, integrated system. Utilizing universal design for learning principles across every aspect of that system, having it guided by district and school design teams. These key features were summarized in Wayne Saylor, who is the director of our center, and Amy McCart's article, Stars in Alignment, just a few years ago. So our framework is not one that's an imposed framework. Here are our big areas that we want you to do work in, right? Here's what you need to do to develop your administrative leadership. Here's what you need to do in multi-tiered system of support. Here's what you need to do with integrated education framework, your staffing and service delivery. Here's how you should engage with families. No, what we did was brought a framework that shows you the big buckets of work that we're all doing in schools all the time anyway. So let's get away from the one more initiative flying at me and give me a way to make sense of all of those initiatives in a way that will sustain over time. What's just the good work, the good community of school? That's the intent of the framework that we provide. It then is used as a guide to kind of measure, reflect, and think about our progress toward building an inclusive school for all kids. And our initial data is really starting to come together, and it's so fun. I can't wait to share it with you. I'm not going to share all the data this morning because it's fun, but you can read it online. But we're seeing nice relationships between the kind of full implementation of some of these core features and their relationships to increasing reading achievement, increasing math achievement, and placement of kids with disabilities in least restrictive environments. Okay, you want to see kids, and you want to see what it looks like. I can describe all day. So let's move to some examples. So just quick data. One of my indicators is if it's working for kids with the most extensive support needs, then maybe we're on the right track. Right? Then we're going to figure out everybody else with that as well. And we are seeing pretty significant shifts for our kids who would be on alternate assessment based on alternate achievement standards, so our 2nd through 8th graders within our 64 schools across the 5 states with whom we're currently working. We're seeing an increase from about 19% to about 32% of that population spending 80% or more of their time in general ed settings, which is well above what the national averages have been for that population for the last 10 years. We've kind of flatlined in that area for this population in LRE data. And we're seeing a corresponding decrease in the amount of time that kids are spending out of general ed settings. We're also measuring and paying attention to their participation in core Tier 1 reading and math academics. And we're seeing a nice increase across 3 years. We've more than doubled the percentage of students on alternate assessments who are participating in core reading instruction. So what does that look like? Let's do a couple of kids' stories before we wrap up for the morning. I want to introduce you to Madeline and her school and family.
Madeline, it's your turn.
I know the children need us. That's the most important thing. The children in the Mississippi Delta can learn just as well as any other children in the U.S., but their experiences and exposures are very limited. We are one of the highest when it comes to illnesses of diabetes and other health in the state. The median income status here for Sunflower County is around approximately $19,000 a year. And that's not a whole lot. Y'all have a good day. At James C. Rosser, we believe in a vision that all children will work together to build a community of dedicated and productive citizens. They know that we are here as a team, and they know that we have to take ownership of whatever our data says because it belongs to us. They know that all of our job is that we want to see all of our students grow. Good morning, Madeline. How are you? You been sick?
Miss Wilkins will get that later. Okay, good.
I want her to be in that class with the regular kids, the kids that can talk, because she's learning the same thing that they are learning. And I don't want, even though she's kind of behind with her speech, I don't want her to be that much behind being in a different class. So I want her to stay with the kids in her age group, because they also help her too. She sees stuff they do and she wants to do it.
You see in that short clip the importance of principals as instructional leaders, very hands-on, very engaged principal, not sitting in her corner office. You see a mom who's very much in the conversation and holding really high expectations and communicating to her child every single day the worth of going to school, the benefit of going to school. All the videos I'm showing you now are available online. If you want to see the full clips and the instruction around them, we'll be able to get you there. I want to move on to showing you a little bit of a conversation that was referred to as multiple access points in one of our recent videos, Whatever It Takes.
Multiple access points.
When I'm planning for a lesson, I try to give my students multiple access points. This involves different ways of visualizing the material. I know some students learn better by reading, so I make sure that there's an element of reading in there. Some students will learn better if they write it afterwards. Some students need to see it. Some students need to touch it. Sometimes it may feel like a circus, but it's trying to meet the needs of every student in the class.
You will be getting a circle magnet to hold the train or bus onto the Newton scale. This is a new piece of equipment you're going to learn to use. What it does is measure force.
I've worked with Ashley for 2 years now. I taught her in 7th grade science and now in 8th grade science. It was difficult for her to learn how to use the eye gaze machine. Once we started doing that, I started making notebook files so she can look at and switch between the screens. The eye gaze has definitely helped her to become more a part of the class.
I want you to write a question for Ashley. I want you to... Okay, I'm going to give you a marker. We need to try to help her figure out if the new ramp is going to have more or less. So, will the new ramp have more or less effort?
A more or B less?
I'm not sure what the answer is.
She will work with her peers, and she will also be able to go around to different lab stations. So she is capable of learning grade level content as it's relevant. Having students like Ashley with severe disabilities in my classroom benefits every student because they see what the real world is like. They're going to be out in society with people who have different challenges than them. But the more that you are exposed to people with different challenges, different disabilities, the more you're able to show compassion and to help each other out.
I just dig that she's so matter-of-fact about that, right? For some folks, that's a big leap, and she just gets it at her core. As a classroom teacher, it's just wonderful that she welcomes Ashley and the complexities that come with teaching Ashley. I actually do work pretty closely with this particular district. And these are teachers who are asking, as Paula Kluth would say, what's next? Right? So I figured this piece out, what's next? They're a district that, as Louis Lord Nelson would want us to invest in, how are we teaching with learner variability in mind every single day? How are we guiding the design of what we're doing with universal design for learning principles? The presentation that I'll give, small plug, the presentation I'll give later this afternoon is an in-depth dive into this district. Now I want you to meet one more person from this district, actually two people, Jacob and his father.
This is your X, this is your Y, this is your M. Jacob is a student with autism, and he also has some attention needs.
Jacob, we're gonna, okay, 10:05, but you need to use the clock. You don't need to use the computer. One of the reasons Jacob is finding so much success and having so much progress is because we were giving him more responsibility, and he's learning that he can handle that responsibility. I think in the past it was maybe taken for granted maybe that he would need someone on him all the time, constantly telling him what to do, and we're finding that he doesn't need that. I like to float around, and I like to work with as many students as possible because, first of all, I don't want Jacob to feel, or any student that I'm working with to feel that I'm just there for them and that they're kind of singled out. And I want every kid in that classroom also to be comfortable coming to me for anything. I absolutely think that if I was next to him all the time, it would be a barrier. It would kind of hinder his progress with social action with other students.
Okay, so put one underneath of it.
Segregating autistic students, that's the most dumbest and pathetic excuse that I can ever think of. Because they want to get along with the other classmates. It's just like segregation and apartheid. And if this was ever like an autistic school that would be segregated from just a normal school, I would probably feel very sad.
See you later. Bye, Mr. Deacons. Bye, Jacob.
My family has been in this community for over 100 years. My dad graduated from this very school building in 1946. My fear was that he was going to be someone that was going to have to be guided and directed his entire life, and that's not the case. I believe he's going to make a difference in this world. And my hopes and dreams are that he has a happy and productive life.
Everybody take a moment. It's okay. This entire effort that we're engaged in is one of service. And it's service to the voice of Jacob. It's service to the values of his father. That's the long-term voice. That's our leadership right there. Our job is now to figure out how do we do that service in a way that makes sure that Jacob is an essential part of that community. Can you imagine the loss to that school if that voice wasn't showing up every day? The power of that voice every single day in that school. And the commitment of his dad to say, I don't know about your evidence-based practices, that's great, and your multisyllabic systems of support, which I'm sure he does understand. His value is that his father went to this school, and he went to this school, and his son will go to this school, and his son's children will go to this school. The rest is up to us to make that work for them. Equity-based inclusion works to ensure that sense of belonging, right? We're restructuring things to make sure that that's happening and that it's not hinged on an individual leader, an individual teacher, right? That we're regrouping in a larger endeavor here. At the S.W.I.F.T Center, we truly believe we can transform education. If we're doing it together, we will be much better together doing this work. We opened with all means all, and for me, the check on all means all is to come back at it with each and every. We can get lost looking across the sea, and it's important to stop and check on Ashley and Jacob and Madeline. Is it working for each and every student? With and without a disability, who does or does not originate as an English language user, whether you're from poverty or from wealth, whether you're an accelerated math or you're a struggling reader. We can do this if we're doing it together. If you'd like additional resources, please check out our website. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube. There's an amazing amount of resources, and hey, your tax dollars paid for it, so please tap into that. I want to thank you for your time and effort this morning, and I wish you the best of luck in the rest of the conference today and through all of your work. Please take these messages forward and go teach.